So I've heard this thing a lot about like be the change that you want to see in the world. So I'm trying to be the content that I want to see on YouTube. Uh, and so to the two other people in the world out there who would like to see the same kind of YouTube content as me, welcome. In this video today, we're going to be spinning some wool and talking about the history of mathematical formalism. So, little introduction to wool spinning here. I want to tell you a little bit about the process. So, we're going to start with some raw wool. This is mohair. Mohair comes from the Angora goat. The name of this goat in particular is Jeffrey. I got this from a small 2-goat farm that's selling the wool on Etsy. So really wonderful material to work with. I love this color. It's kind of golden. The younger goats produce a softer hair and it gets a little bit more coarse the more adult you get, but of course they produce more wool. So it tends to be a little bit cheaper. So Jeffrey is still a kid, little kid. And so this is very, very soft. So you can see it's got these nice little curls on it. A lot of people will just kind of spin the mohair like this, just in its kind of raw form. I like to card it first to get a kind of softer, loftier wool. The carding process is you basically take these combs, so very fine teeth on them, and then you just put the wool on these cards and you brush them to align all of the fibers in the same direction. And once you've done that, you pull them off the cards in these little, I like to use these little forms. I think they're called rollags, like this. So you can see this nice little lofted roll of wool here. And from that, you can spin your yarn. So I like to use a drop spindle. I think the spinning wheel is really iconic and probably how most people in the West think of spinning, like Sleeping Beauty and stuff. But this is like Stone Age technology, a lot cheaper. This cost me like 10 bucks, and wonderful mahogany little drop spindle here. But basically you just put the rollag on the end and you just spin the wool until it forms this kind of tight little yarn. So that's what I'm working on right now with this mohair. I also have these silk cocoons. So this is piece silk. Silk is usually, like most commercial silk, is produced by taking the cocoons of the silkworm and boiling them while the silkworm is still inside the cocoon. The reason for this is because at that stage, the fibers in the cocoon are relatively longer, they're more intact. And also the cocoons themselves are larger, so there's more silk per cocoon. So it does produce in some ways a more quality silk, or at least one that's more viable for commercial production. But if you're vegan or if you're trying to avoid products that are made with animal cruelty, pea silk is generally a better option. So with pea silk, they allow the silkworms to emerge from the cocoon naturally before the cocoon is harvested. So what I like to do with these is I card these as well. You can use another process called reeling, although that may not work as I think it can be done still with the pea silk, but I've been enjoying carding because it means that I can blend it with wool. So this is a silk wool blend made with hair from a silky goat. My mom's silky goat, his name is Coda. Blended that probably 50-50 blend with silk, and it's very strong, as you can see. So I really like the silk wool blends, love working with both of them. Relatively new to this, so it's just a hobby, but I think it's really neat. It's a nice kind of meditative activity to get into. Interesting fact that I came across. Have not fact-checked this, so kids, do your own research. This is just some random lady on YouTube saying this, but it made sense to me that how we call women that are old and can't find a man spinsters? Well, it's because back in the day, spinning was one of the biggest trades for women. And if a woman was very good at her trade in spinning, she could become financially independent and not require a man to support her financially. And so they were spinsters, right? That's where that use of the term supposedly comes from. Um, so here I am potentially spreading misinformation, but interesting idea for you to look up on your own and let me know if I'm wrong, because I am too lazy to Google it right now. I have other things going on. Thank you for fact checking me. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to the wool spinning that we're going to be doing here now. So I'll just get my cards loaded up with some raw mohair here. I do have some that's already partially carded, so I'll probably load these onto the cards as well. But while we're doing that, I wanted to talk a little bit maybe about the history of mathematical formalism and this kind of interesting chapter in the history and philosophy of math. So I guess that the area that or the time period that I'm focusing on is the turn of the century. But in order to really contextualize some of this, I wanted to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. So we're going to start at Euclid. And Euclid might be familiar to any of you who did geometry, like this really traditional geometry with proofs. And I don't know if they really do that in schools here in America anymore. But at one point, that was kind of like the gold standard for mathematics education. And the reason for that is that it's based around one of the first examples of a mathematical axiomatic system. So a lot of big words in there. What we mean by an axiomatic system is just a set of rules, so a set of assumptions that we make, a set of logical rules that we apply to those assumptions in order to get more things that must therefore be true. So the idea here, right, is that if we can all kind of agree on the starting assumptions, and we can agree on the logical rules that we can apply to those starting assumptions, then we can build up a more complex system in which the truth of those statements is completely inarguable. Like once you've proved something, you can say, yes, this is absolutely true. And this is a little bit different than something, say, like science, right? Where in science we have, or at least in theory, we have our hypothesis, we do our experiment, we make some observations, and we kind of say whether the observations support the hypothesis or not. But then we're always gathering new observations, and this can kind of change whether or not we believe the hypothesis to be true as we're making new observations. So science is something that we would call like an inductive system of reasoning, whereas mathematics, at least as Euclid presented it, and as it is practiced now, is a deductive system. So you start with the things that you assume to be true, and from that you prove the rest of truth. Whereas in science, you start with things, observations that are true in some sense, whatever it means for an observation to be true, that doesn't really check out, but then you sort of put together your truths from these observations. You induct these general principles, these general laws of nature. So returning to Euclid for a moment, Euclid starts with these 5 rules, and I can't remember all of them exactly, but they're very simple things. The shortest distance between 2 lines is a point. Starting from a single point, you can make a circle with any given radius, stuff like this. And then from that, we deduce all the things you know and love, like the Pythagorean theorem, and a bunch of other kind of properties of right triangles, and you have the whole of classical geometry. And a proof is just starting from is a series of logical steps, starting from our basic assumptions, and ending at some statement. So you start with something you know to be true, you make reasonable logical steps, you come to some conclusion, and you know that that conclusion must be true as well. And that sequence of steps from what you know to be true, your axioms or your assumptions, to your conclusion, which you call your theorem, that whole chain of steps is called a proof. Right, so there's some fairly simple proofs that you could look up. One proof that I might suggest that I think is fairly easy to understand is the proof that there are infinitely many primes. And the proof for this, the reason there's a little bit of complexity in this is that it's a proof by contradiction. So a proof by contradiction is a really interesting proof structure. Basically, what a proof by contradiction does is it says, okay, I want to prove that something is true. So I'm going to assume that its opposite is true. And then I'm going to prove that if I assume its opposite is true, I find a contradiction. Therefore, its opposite cannot be true. So my thing that I wanted to prove itself is in fact true, because its opposite simply cannot be the case. So that's the idea behind a proof by contradiction. But let's return now to the 20th century, so jumping like 2,000 years ahead. We've been kind of working with Euclid. We think we have an idea of what a standard of mathematical formalism looks like, right? And it's, I was gonna give you this example of the proof of the infinitude of the primes. So let's just go ahead and do that. Assume by way of contradiction that there are finitely many primes, okay? Multiply them all together and add 1. Well, that new number that you just created, that's all of the primes multiplied together plus 1, isn't divisible by any of the primes in your list, right? Because there will always be a remainder of 1 because of that little plus 1. So that means that there was a prime, either your new number is itself a prime number because it's not divisible by any of the other prime numbers, or it's divisible by some other prime number. But in either case, your list of all of the prime numbers couldn't have been complete. Therefore, it's a contradiction to assume that you can have a finite list of primes. There must be infinitely many primes. So that was the general kind of flavor that mathematical proofs took on. I mean, sometimes you'd have pictures involved and whatnot. Sometimes they were a little bit more geometrical, but you could kind of talk through a proof. And in practice, most mathematical proofs that you see are still kind of ones that you can talk through, although only if you're a professional mathematician, probably. But that kind of changed. Our way of thinking about the standard for a formal proof changed at the turn of the century. And there were a lot of people that were working on this, but I want to focus on Bertrand Russell. David Hilbert was another huge character that was involved in formalizing mathematics. But, you know, around this time, around the turn of the century, they started to realize that things were not quite as formal as we wanted them to be, right? Like there's nuances in natural language that they were trying to formalize out. The idea or the dream was to have this finite language, finite set of symbols, really definitive order that you could put these symbols into. And then you could move these symbols around in some predetermined way. And from the manipulation of these symbols, you could say this is true. And the goal of formalism was that one would never have to make reference to anything like intuition or the meaning of the symbols in order to deduce the truth of a sentence. So we don't want to have to rely on a concept like meaning if we're trying to be strict formalists. We want the symbols to carry everything that they need to in them, and then meaning can just be the icing on the cake. And this seems a little bit maybe far out, like why would you want to do that? But keep in mind that this is kind of what allows modern computing to exist, right? Like you need a computer to be able to just shuffle symbols around without having to really understand the meaning of what it's doing. And in fact, much of the developments philosophically and mathematically in this era did lead eventually to what we now know as modern computing. So let's go back to Bertrand Russell and Hilbert, right? They have this dream of coming up with like this really well-defined mathematical language this finite set of rules that everybody agrees to, and then from that you eventually deduce all of mathematics. You can find every mathematical truth, right? And the goal of this was to extend beyond mere mathematics. So Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote a book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, most often referred to as the Tractatus, in shortly after World War I. So interestingly, he served as a medic in World War I, and he wrote much of the notes that would become the Tractatus in the trenches during World War I. And it's such an interesting work. It varies between being a logical treatise and like a mystical, almost religious treatise towards the end. But that the mystical aspects of the Tractatus were largely ignored by his academic contemporaries, because what he built up in the Tractatus was a philosophical system, which later became referred to more or less as logical positivism, which allowed this dream of having this formal system that describes reality in these really strict ways, and then, you can go from there. It allowed that kind of system to be extended beyond mathematics and into science, presumably. Now, Wittgenstein himself in the Tractatus, I think, his intent was to be very, very limited in what could really be said in that way. But I think that the dream was a lot bigger than that. And Wittgenstein became one of the greatest detractors for his work in the Tractatus later on. He even says at the very end of the Tractatus, like, now that I have shown you the limits of this way of thinking, you can kick back down the ladder and never have to think about things in this way again. Like, you can be free from the restrictiveness, essentially, of this way of being or thinking. But yeah, the Tractatus really caught on like wildfire in these circles that were trying to formalize mathematics. So people like Bertrand Russell, who was Wittgenstein's close mentor, really latched onto this in service of this goal. So Bertrand Russell's main opus in service of this goal of formalizing mathematics was something called the Principia Mathematica. And it was this very, very ambitious effort, which was to just take the axioms and kind of apply the rules in this systematic ways, so that over the course of time, every mathematically true statement would eventually be produced in one of these volumes of the Principia Mathematica. And if you look at them, like, they're just incredibly dense. There's just a really high level of formalism, one that you don't even really see in practice in modern mathematics today. It's something that a computer would be able to understand. There are some mathematicians that are working on translating contemporary proofs, so proofs as they're written now in mathematical journals, into a more formal language that could be understood by computers, and mathematicians that are even working on automating this process. But that has yet to really take off as something which is used by most contemporary mathematicians. I think that math is headed to its own replicability crisis along these lines, but that's a topic for another time. Returning now to Bertrand Russell and the Principia Mathematica. Interesting historical anecdote about this. Bertrand Russell wrote the Principia Mathematica with a man named Alfred North Whitehead, whose wife he had an affair with. So, not to be crass, but Bertrand Russell really struggled to keep it in his pants. I think he also had an affair with like T.S. Eliot's wife, kind of just notorious for these kind of shenanigans. And yet, still, the thing that people remember him for is his like mathematical and philosophical contributions. So I think that says something about the about the longevity of his work and his influence. Anyway, Principia Mathematica, beautiful dream, a lot of work poured into it. Didn't pan out. A man named Kurt Gödel just came in and really screwed everything up. So I should mention also David Hilbert in this. I feel like this was kind of Hilbert's dream too, that Gödel was crushing. Gödel comes barging onto the scene in like the 1930s with something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And I think he himself may have been in his 30s at this point in time. He was very young. And what Gödel's incompleteness theorem says is essentially that a mathematical system, which is strong enough to do arithmetic in, which of course we would like to do arithmetic, but like a mathematical system can either be consistent or complete, but not both. And what we mean by consistency is merely that the system doesn't prove a contradiction. What we mean by completeness is that the system proves every true statement. And so what Gödel is saying is if you have a mathematical system in which there is no contradiction, well then that system must also have true statements that cannot be proved. And this really threw a wrench in the whole dream, right? Because now why were we even writing the Principia? Like it was gonna be missing mathematical truths anyway, like despite our best efforts, even if we were to be able to continue it on indefinitely to infinity, the whole dream was just kind of demolished. And it's, you know, it's probably for the better. I think it introduced a lot more color into mathematics, but I think at the same time, these kind of statements about the limitations of mathematics and limitations of formalism are something that all mathematicians are familiar with, but statements with which most practicing mathematicians don't like to spend a lot of time talking about. It still feels to me a little bit like the skeleton in the back of the closet, right? And like I'm trained a little bit as a set theorist, and it certainly doesn't feel that way amongst other set theorists because this is just, it's what we do. But I think for most other mathematicians that I've spoken to, it's, oh yeah, that Gödel thing, like, oh, this, you know, weird models and weird interpretations of set theory, like I don't touch that stuff. I don't touch undecidability. I don't take extra axioms. I just, nope. And I think that points to kind of a larger issue that mathematicians may have facing the limitations of our system's ability to speak to truth. I think that mathematicians like to think of their method of coming to truth as being somehow less human, less prone to error or oversight. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. So, you know, I think that this is kind of a good point to wrap up that summary. We have yet to spin any wool, but we have produced quite a few little roll eggs here. So maybe in the next video, we will talk more about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Turing and the introduction of modern computing. Maybe we'll even just jump ahead to contemporary times and talk a little bit about the ethics of AI while we spin some wool. Who knows? But join me next time, or don't. I will be here spinning my wool and talking about math.